Okay, so I am going to kick this off now. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jo Healy. I'm the Executive Director of the British American Business Council, Northern California. For a bit of background, the BABC is a not-for-profit membership organisation, one of 18 chapters in the US and 4 in the UK. We all share a common mission of strengthening the economic corridor between the US and the UK. And normally we convene to serve a growing number of a network of companies and business leaders through networking opportunities, bespoke programming, and various marketing platforms. We actively promote trade and investment and support those who make the transatlantic corridor a part of their business growth ambitions. If you are interested to learn more about this chapter, please contact me in the chat. Our panelists today have put together some insightful content around the current landscape for global mobility and immigration. The session is being recorded and will be shared with you after the event. You will have the opportunity to post your questions in the Q&A feature, and Greg will monitor those for the panelists to answer at the end of the session. Please keep yourselves on mute. So with that, it's my pleasure to kick off today's session, and starting with Greg, I will allow the panelists to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Jo. Hello, everybody. My name is Greg Wald. I'm a partner at Squire Patton Boggs Labor and Employment Practice. The SPB Global Employment Practice includes more than 155 employment and immigration lawyers across the world. I have the pleasure of directing our U.S. immigration practice, which focuses on employer-sponsored visas, immigration-related compliance matters. Now let me turn over to one of our co-panelists, Mei Chung of our London office, to introduce herself. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Yes, my name's Mei Chung. I'm based in the London office at Squire Patton Boggs. I'm a senior associate in the employment labour team, dealing mainly with immigration matters. So all the inbound stuff to the UK. I've literally been dealing with immigration for many, many years. So I've seen it change over from work permit all the way through to the PBS and, obviously with the current changes. So today I'm going to talk about what recent changes there are and what changes we can expect for companies moving to the UK already based in the UK.
Sean, you want to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Greg. Good morning or good evening, everybody. I'm Sean Randolph. I'm Senior Director at the Bay Area Council Economic Institute. We're basically a think tank on the economy of Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and California. We're based in the largest business organization in the region, the Bay Area Council, about 350 companies, pretty much all sectors, looking at the development of the economy here in our region and in the state.
Dinesh.
Yeah. Hi there, Dinesh Chandra, also known as Dino to most people. So I'm a partner at Crow UK, part of Crow Global. So we're 36,000 people in 146 countries. I specialize in global mobility, so payroll taxes, social security, income taxes, corporate taxes. All of that is my specialist area, and I've been doing that for 21 years.
Thanks, Dinesh. Jo, could you take us to the next slide? One more, thank you. Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of overview of what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to touch upon topics such as, is California open for business? We're also going to talk about the environment post-Brexit in the UK, especially as they're coming out of, or the world's coming out of COVID, and what to expect on the ground there. We're also going to talk about legally what's changed and hasn't changed, and what employers and you all should expect coming into the next year, kind of on both sides of the pond. We're also going to touch on some of the barriers that employers have faced, navigating through the pandemic. Issues like remote workers and what that means, and what are the legal issues, what are the operational issues that employers have faced, especially in terms of global mobility. We're going to use a couple case studies toward the end to kind of illustrate that, and then hopefully we'll have time to answer some of your questions. What I want to also discuss, maybe to kick us off here, is with the latest and greatest on the changes to the U.S. travel restrictions. Before we get to Sean, I'll just summarize that. So you might have all seen that the U.S. government announced that effective effective November 8th, we're changing our travel ban, COVID-related travel ban that has impacted 33 countries, specifically the UK, Ireland, and all of the EU, as well as China, Brazil, and some other countries. And so what we're doing is we're making rules that apply across the board, and essentially requiring fully vaccinated travelers, or the travelers are fully vaccinated before you can enter the US. These new rules will take effect at 12:01 on November 8th, and it's a welcome change, because what that means is that many of the requests for national interest exceptions to get folks into the US will go by the wayside, and if someone meets the full vaccination requirements, they'll be able to come over. The vaccinations that are acceptable are all the ones that are approved by our FDA and the World Health Organization, and those are all the major vaccines that people are familiar with: the J&J, the Pfizer, the Moderna, AstraZeneca, Covishield, Sinopharm, and Sinovac. We also will accept a mixture of those vaccinations, because many countries, especially those in Europe, based on supply and other issues, have permitted people to mix, let's say, AstraZeneca with Pfizer or something of that kind of sort. So that will also be acceptable. And the documentation required to prove that you're fully vaccinated is also pretty expansive. Won't get into too many of the details, but documentation that most people that are acceptable in most people's countries will be acceptable for proof coming into the United States. And there's going to be a system set up where the boarding airlines will collect this information. There'll still be a requirement for a negative COVID test issued within 3 days of travel to the US. That will still be required even for vaccinated travelers. There'll be certain exceptions applicable to these rules, such as for diplomats, crew members, children under 18, exceptions for individuals that are coming from countries where vaccinations are not readily available, and so forth. So we'll have more details in the coming days, but just wanted to let everyone know where we're going from there. With that, I wanted to turn it over to Sean to kind of give us a state of play of what's going on in California and whether things are open for business these days.
Thanks very much, Greg. I'm going to remove a very small and noisy cat who is crawling over my screen. He wants to be part of the action. Sorry. Oh boy. Anyway, thanks very much for joining us today, everybody. I can give a short perspective on what's going on here in the economy of the San Francisco Bay region and California. Especially coming out of the pandemic, where are we at the moment in that particular transition, and where do we think we're heading in the year or so ahead? So if you look at it from the standpoint of employment as a measure of activity, in the last year, California's created more than 800,000 jobs, and in any given month, it's accounted for 20, 30, or 40% of all the new job creation in the United States. So from that standpoint, it's looking to be a strong but somewhat sporadic recovery. In the state, the unemployment rate is still relatively high, 7.5%. And part of that is because the labor participation is growing. More people are coming back into the workforce. If we look at the San Francisco Bay Area that includes Silicon Valley, however, where we're below 5% unemployment, is 4.8%. And I think what's going on here is that there are certain sectors that are really suffering still. So we've got a huge hospitality sector, so much relates to tourism. And we're still down 300,000 leisure and hospitality jobs. You know, tourism just has not really picked up internationally yet. We see tourists here, they're mostly US, not as many international. So hopefully the US opening up to travel from overseas and from Europe will help that. But what has happened remarkably, or most interestingly, is that tech has really prospered for the most part during the pandemic. Tech jobs have grown 4.4% here, and we see a lot of the tech companies here doing extremely well because we do so much that is digital, and so much of the global economy has been accelerated in the last year and a half in the direction of digital technologies. So I think when you look at the economy here, you can't have to look at it kind of like a tale of two cities. Are you looking at the state? Are you looking at a region? And then what sectors are you looking at? Again, some like hospitality and tourism still suffering a lot. Others in tech and biotech especially, which is booming, doing very, very well, especially under the circumstances. We're seeing some big structural changes here because of remote work, and this will be familiar to all of you. I think it's a global phenomenon. But you know, when we look in our organization at the percentage of jobs that could be done remotely, we find that over half of all residents here in all occupations are eligible for remote work. And during the pandemic, companies have taken advantage of that. And we're seeing today a range of responses as people figure out what to do next. One is, you've seen some companies just canceling their leases and saying, we're not going to have headquarters. You find others like Facebook saying they're going to accommodate some workers being remote permanently. Salesforce is doing that as well. They're accommodating the desire of their employees to be have a flexible work arrangements if they want to. We're seeing a lot of leases ending and offices consolidating. So the models are out there. You know, a few companies are saying we're going to have no headquarters in the future, will be totally remote. Others are saying, a few are saying we'll return entirely, but not very many. And most are looking at a hybrid model, and pretty much every company is trying to figure that out for themselves. So that does have a big impact on like our downtowns. Will office buildings refill? But I think one of the interesting things to note is in the third quarter, we may have turned a corner on people coming back, anticipating coming back into offices. There was a lot of sublet space on the market here in San Francisco, especially. We started to see some of that being absorbed. And I think one of the things that I try to watch is commitments being made for new office towers, new tech parks, and we're seeing large developers continuing on commitments to build office towers and a lot of announcements of new tech parks. I think part of the calculation there is they're betting that these things will be up and running within 3 to 4 years, and by then the economy will be back on its feet. So that's interesting to watch, but the developers are making a strong bet for the medium term on the economy recovering fully and those places filling up. It's been in the news. I think some of you may have followed that some companies have left California, left the Bay Area, some longtime tech companies. It's true. Where have they gone? Texas primarily, some to Arizona, Washington, Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, mostly neighboring states. A couple factors are there. Some are looking for lower taxes. The biggest question, though, is around housing. It's really expensive here, and I think what happened was that COVID accelerated a prior trend where, you know, we're so expensive and a lot of people really can't afford to live here. So people with remote work scattered around, not that many, but a lot, some did. And I think some companies are shifting some operations to go to where their workers can afford to live more easily. I think one of the things to note there, though, is we estimate that of those that actually left core cities, like in Silicon Valley and San Francisco, most of them, more than 80%, didn't leave California. Most of them actually went to suburbs where they could get more space and cheaper housing, but they didn't leave the region. So the other thing that I think we'll see, I hope we'll see certainly, is that while inevitably some companies will leave, and we'd never like that to happen, the historical trend has been they've been replaced by fast-growing younger companies that fill in quickly behind them. So the issues we have around cost are real, but I think there's some reason for us to be optimistic here that younger, fast-growing companies are going to come in very quickly and fill the gap. I think one measure is going to be looking at the future, what's happening in venture capital. So last year was a record year for venture investment. This year is looking to be another record year for venture investment. Historically, more than a third of all the venture capital invested in the entire United States is invested here in the San Francisco Bay region, and often as much or more than 40%. So if you look at the IPO pipeline here, and this graphic will suggest it, the Bay Area really dominates the national IPO pipeline. Almost half, 40% of the major IPOs, or all the IPOs, are actually locally based companies, and almost half of those that are valued at 10 billion or more are local companies. And so what that suggests to me is that the pipeline is really strong for new company formation and new company growth here in the region. One pattern we might see is that venture investment gets spread more widely across the country as venture investors can look at other parts of the country to put their money in, as more people and companies are spread around. But I think it's very likely that the investments around where venture capital will be invested will continue to be here. And again, I think our major strength is in digital companies and the digital economy. And I think the world has been propelled in that direction in the last 2 years. And I think that a lot of the technologies we're using today, like Zoom, that have benefited from this change are actually produced here in the region. So I think continued strength in all things digital that affects every industry. And as I mentioned earlier, biotech is really surging. Our universities and laboratories aren't going anywhere. And I talked to a lot of venture capitalists, and to a person, they're saying that they don't think the Bay Area's position in the global technology world is going to be significantly changed or diminished for the foreseeable future. So finally, on the international front, as I mentioned earlier, this hospitality issue challenge, domestic tourists are back, not international yet, but we hope in November we'll turn a corner on that. I think on immigration, I would defer to Greg on that, absolutely. But I think we're seeing it, at a high level, a much more favorable environment for immigration, for people coming in on different kinds of visas and H-1Bs than we saw in the last 4 years. And I think that's going to be, beneficial for us because, we're such a global economy that having that door open is going to be very important for us and for our partners. So the bottom line, the pandemic obviously disrupted a lot of longstanding patterns. It accelerated changes that are already underway. That said, I think the economic fundamentals here are still very strong. I think we're going to see continued strong growth near, medium, long term in technology, everything digital and biotech. But the patterns may shift. And we're still looking to see exactly where the pieces are going to be coming down. In the last 18 months, so much has been blown up in the air. And I think we can see the shape of the future here, but I think none of us are going to predict exactly where the pieces are going to drop. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Speaking of talent or companies kind of being courted out of California, we were just speaking about it on the call before we got on the webinar today, that the UK just announced plans to bring in the best and the brightest and great prospect companies, and one of the targets they have is the Bay Area. So Dinesh, maybe that's a good way to segue to you to kind of give us a little bit, just a minute or two of what are the immediate challenges that businesses are facing in the UK right now in terms of global mobility, operations, and so forth. And of course, I expect that these challenges are similar to what many countries are experiencing worldwide, but give us your take.
Yeah, so I think for people that don't live in the UK is pretty much back to normal. There isn't really anything you can't do in the UK that you could do in 2019. Tourism, a little bit like Sean said, hospitality is not at all the same. A lot of that is because of confidence in traveling. That's not the same. But from a global mobility perspective, what we're seeing, having worked through the pandemic, is since summer, people are relocating, they're moving again. There's a lot of technical change in the air. So the last 18 months has seen tax rules, immigration rules, border rules, and there's a lot of fatigue as to what is the current state of play. But what I am seeing is where there's a good business case for someone to move, they move. Yeah, and that was happening 6 months ago as well. And pretty much on the point around different industries. So we work with a number of construction companies and organizations. Literally, apart from a 3 to 4 week gap in April last year, they just carried on as normal, moving people and getting on with it. So that's kind of the sentiment, Greg, is there around. We're getting back to normal. We're pretty much are normal. As borders open, people are moving. The big issue in the country at the moment, whether you want to buy diesel, petrol, or you want to buy a pizza, is actually labor. Labor is the big issue, and I think it's the big issue around the world. The same issue, which is consumption stalled and contracted during the pandemic. That consumption has now resumed at a pace. And the infrastructure, the supply chains just are not keeping up. I think it's a global issue we're seeing. But then if I look at technical issues, which is the stuff that I do, I guess, for a living, you're moving people, talent in and out of the US, in and out of the UK. The issues, you need to work through are pretty much the ones here. What labor law rights and rules apply to that person? Just because you employ them with one entity in one country, but if they live in another country, don't assume labor does not apply. Labor law doesn't apply in that country. Certain roles, come with regulatory issues. So in financial services, you have to be registered. Actually, lawyers have to be registered with the right kind of local authority and organization. So there's a practical piece there that needs to be touched through and worked through as well. You've got a bunch of payroll type stuff as well. So looking at what is this person generating a payroll tax obligation for me? That's something that needs to be thought through. Do I, as an employer, have to open and register a payroll? That's something that has to be really thought through as well. And then if we're talking more about the startup area, so businesses that don't always have an entity in country, they're scaling up, they're expanding, they're growing internationally. Having people, salespeople, product people in country have to be careful, because the nature of that type of work and duties could mean you create a establishment of your corporate. This is often missed by people as well. So really, it's all the taxes, it's all the payroll stuff, it's all the labor and employment stuff, Greg, that people need to keep an eye on.
Let me ask you. Now that you're coming out of we're post Brexit, right? So these rules are changes, and May's going to obviously talk about some of the immigration impact. But post Brexit, do you have a sense that there's been an impact on new startups or new business, new market entrants, especially those that might have come from the continent, from Europe? Has there been a change or some kind, or is it still too early to see, what impact that has?
That's a great question. I think it kind of depends on the purpose of that business, right? So what we certainly have seen is businesses move or shift part of their supply chain outside of the UK into Europe, Ireland, France, Germany. So if you've got a business that needs to move goods around and your warehouse was in the UK, you probably now got a warehouse in Belgium, for example, as well. So there's been that change. What we thought would happen, we thought, well, if we look at inward investment, would we start to see inward investment flowing to, I don't know, Ireland or Frankfurt or Paris instead of the UK? We haven't seen that happen just yet. And I think there's cultural, I mean, a lot of that investment is US, American investment. There's cultural, language, familiarity with the UK. So we haven't seen that change, not yet.
Okay, thanks, Dinesh. That's good to know. May, you know, let's pivot over. What are the current travel restrictions that we're seeing for entry into the UK, be it business visitors or tourists?
There's obviously still a lot of the rules are the same in terms of business and travels and visitors coming to the UK pre and post Brexit, but who it applies to is different. And now obviously the whole of EU population now needs to come under rules, and that is a problem for a lot of companies to get used to in the UK at the moment, because they're not used to Europeans having to be subject to immigration rules, and it's all new to them, and there's a lot more processes, a lot more costs, which is causing a sort of a new thing for UK companies at the moment, particularly when they have small projects that they've got in the UK with no UK presence at all, and they're looking to send people to come and work in the UK for a short period. Now they need to consider what to do with that individual. Can they come under the visitor rules? Is it possible because of limitations? If it's not possible because of limitations, then what can they do? What sort of options they have? And then they'll have to consider obviously the skilled worker, the intra-company transfer routes, and that does also mean having a sponsor license in the UK, which requires them to have a UK entity. So there is a couple of issues in terms of immigration post-Brexit. I mean, the biggest one, like Dinesh was saying, is shortage of labour. And we've seen obviously empty shelves in supermarkets because of no lorry drivers. We've got no petrol for months or weeks. It felt like months when we were queuing for hours in a night just to get it. It was just difficult, whether it's skilled roles or unskilled roles at the moment. There's a lot of shortages, and the government is planning to do something about the shortages. And they have changed a lot of the rules, and I'll come to the changes in a minute, but they have recognised there's an issue in terms of lack of skilled labour and unskilled labour actually in the UK. In terms of travel restrictions, the UK is still, if we're talking about COVID, UK have relaxed a lot in terms of COVID rules. Like Dinesh was saying, it's quite back to normal. There's only 7 countries left on the red list, meaning they have to go to a quarantine hotel and pay the expensive fees to stay there. But otherwise, most people coming to the UK, they can just quarantine at home if they haven't been fully vaccinated. But if you have been fully vaccinated, there's no even requirements to self-isolate or quarantine anymore. You literally come in, do the test on day 2, and unless you test positive, you're free to roam around. So there's no issues in terms of restrictions on that sense. But in terms of restrictions on Brexit front, that is a little bit different. Okay, I'm not talking about the longer queues that you see in the airport, which partly is due to COVID checks. But then obviously there is the EU nationals joining the queues as well for the non-European and non-British queue, and it is getting longer, although UK has been prepared on that, and they have added a lot of countries to the e-gates list to ease that. So it has been a little bit better, but I'm not actually talking about restrictions in terms of travels on that basis. What I'm talking about is in terms of business visitors, how are they able to come in and not come in? And that has been a great issue at the moment with mainly European workers, because they're not used to it. Like I said earlier, they're not used to having them not being able to work here. They have to look at the business visitor rules again, the permissible activities, what's allowed, what's not allowed again. And it is very small, and that's another limitation in terms of the immigration rule, because the immigration rules are drafted in a particular way where there's a very stringent list of things you can do as a visitor. And I know some companies are not even aware of this list, and they've just sent people here anyways, and that's when we notice there's problems, there's issues with not just immigration, probably tax and everything else as well. In terms of coming into the UK, those who do know there's an issue and they need to apply for a visa to come into the UK first, there are issues in terms of costs, having a license in place, and also applying for a visa for the individual before they come in. And half the time it needs to happen very quickly because the business meeting is next week or whatever it is, and it doesn't happen overnight. It just delays the process a little bit because they're not prepared that this needs to happen. And that is one of the immigration limitations and restrictions at the moment. But saying that, I've just had inquiry. I've dealt with another country last week on a Danish visa, and their processing time is actually 3 to 4 months compared to the UK. And I thought, actually, UK isn't too bad compared to that. Then actually, it's much better.
Well, we're way worse than both of those in many of our posts throughout the world. So.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you, you mentioned just now there's been some changes to the confines of the business visitor visas. So is there one or two things that employers need to know? So let's say a US company wants to send over someone for a business visit. Let's say they plan to stay a few weeks, attend meetings and so forth. Has anything significantly changed on that front regarding what this individual can and can't do while in the UK? They're typically admitted, right, for if I'm not mistaken, for up to, is it
6 months?
6 months?
Yes.
So, anything that major changes that we should be aware of on that front, or are these changes mostly impacting EU nationals?
The visitor rules are the same for EU nationals and US going forward now. The visitor rules itself hasn't actually changed. Okay, we are going to watch this space because they are saying it's going to change. And I think one of the things they announced earlier today in the budget statement as well is that there's going to be a global mobility business visa going forward. And I don't think that is going to be something that replaces the business visitor visa, but I think it's more of a expansion to allow maybe a lot more people to come in, more flexibility to come in to work in the UK. We don't have anything in writing yet, but I assume that is more for transferring existing workers to the UK to work for a short period, or having contractors in the UK to work for a short period, because that is the current gap in the UK in the immigration rules.
Okay, that's good to know. Would you say that coming out of COVID, you've seen some changes that are actually kind of on the positive side, negative side? I can definitely speak to a few points on the U.S. side of things, but curious to know what has, if there's been any silver linings in this cloud.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of Brexit, the change rules has been a lot more flexible for work visas already. The business visitor hasn't changed, but the work visa routes have changed, and they have made the skill level a lot lower for sponsorship. So it means a lot more roles are eligible for sponsorship in the UK. The salary levels also come down. They've got rid of like the advertising requirements and just replaced it with genuine vacancy. So it has made it a little bit easier for sponsors, for UK companies to sponsor workers to actually work in the UK. In terms of COVID, we've seen a lot more flexibility from the Home Office side as well. So they have actually they have been granting people who can't leave the UK due to COVID something called exceptional assurance, which is not a visa or anything, but it allows them to stay in the UK legally. If they are allowed to work beforehand, they can work, they can continue to work in the UK with no problems. And some of them have also been able to switch from this exceptional assurance to a skilled worker visa if they need to in the UK. So I can see the human side coming out of the Home Office, where they've seen the issue and they've allowed more flexibility. They've moved things online, and they've accepted things that are e-copies instead of asking for original copies all the time. They've become a lot more sensitive in the terms of the issues with businesses in the UK already. So I mean, UK is still open for business in that terms, because they, there is a lot of ways to maneuver in terms of, if there's an issue, they will come up with a pragmatic view and they'll get it through. If there's something that you need urgently, there is priority service, there is super priority service that you can pay for with additional fees, but you can get the visa really quickly. So Just an example, I mean, in France, they have super priority, so you can get a visa in the same day. If you really need to come to the UK that quickly, you can do. Obviously, it's subject to appointment availability, but there are those options available. And I know some countries there isn't, and there's just a long time before they can come.
Well, that's really nice to know. I will say that on the US side, at our consular posts, especially in London and a few other select places in Europe, they just have not resumed normal operations. They're not quite out of the COVID environment, in the sense that their staffs have been strained or their resources have been strained. And part of that is due to COVID. Part of that is due to the policies of our previous administration, where we kind of hollowed out a good portion of our diplomatic corps. And so what we're seeing is, like, for example, at the US Embassy in London, I'm sure some of the folks on this webinar might have endured this, basically no appointments right now, or appointments for many visas just on an emergency basis. And so this has been the case for the last year. Our hope is that come November 8th, when the consulates and the embassies will get out of the special national interest exception business, or so we hope, that a lot of resources will be freed up. We have seen on the positive side some posts in other countries, specifically in Asia, where they've gotten kind of back to normal operations. But again, it's still a challenge. One positive thing of COVID that we've seen on the US immigration side is we also have gone to a system where original signatures are not required for domestic US filings. And that has been a godsend, because of course, during the pandemic, when no one was in the offices, was very difficult, but has also made processing these applications much more efficient. We're hoping that change is here to stay. We'll see. Another thing that we've seen, kind of, again, with the change of our administrations, is a lot of some of the restrictionist policies that we previously had have been pulled back, and we're kind of back to where we were on many fronts, where we were at the end of the Obama administration. There's still some things that are kind of going to take time to change, and there's some things that I think this administration will quietly keep in place from the previous administration, and that happens every time we have a change. They come in and say we're going to undo everything from the past, but they don't always undo everything from the past. So we definitely have some aspects of U.S. immigration that have kind of changed, maybe for the long term, but hurdles that were bogging down the system for the most part have been lifted. So certain requirements of in-person interviews and biometric appointments for spouses and family members of business visa holders have gone by the wayside, and that has contributed to a reduction in backlog of applications. So we are actually seeing some positive changes as we come out of the pandemic. Yeah, in many cases, in many cities, businesses are back to normal, but we've seen the interest in movement of people into the United States slowly start to pick up. Certain individuals throughout the pandemic, executive key individuals, continue to be transferred in and out of the US. I think a lot of companies put on hold a lot of expat assignments for various reasons. We're starting to see some of that pick up again. Domestic hiring in the US has still been on a very high clip. We also have a labor shortage in many sectors throughout the US. And so all that has contributed to keeping immigration going, but at maybe not obviously the same pace that we saw coming into the pandemic. So I think we're going to see some changes in that front going forward. With that, I want to go on to our case studies. So our panelists can kind of chime in and we can cover some of these issues. Go back to case study 1. Okay, let me read the facts and then I'm going to kind of pose these questions to you all. A Mexican employee on assignment in the UK for 5 years, has been on assignment for the UK in 5 years. He has a visa to work in the UK, which ends in September of next year. However, due to the pandemic, the employee went to the US for the past year to spend time with his wife, who's a US national, living in the US citizen. He's continued to work remotely, and has not entered the UK due to travel restrictions. So there's a few questions, and I'm going to cover the first one is, can the employee continue to stay in the US with his wife? Well, that all depends on what visa the employee came in with when they entered the US. And sorry about that, everyone, with the slides. And as a Mexican national, this individual would have been eligible for what we call our TN visa based on our treaty with Mexico and Canada, the USMCA, which used to be called NAFTA. So the individual might have secured or should have secured a visa such as that. The individual might have secured an L1 intracompany transfer visa. Now, if they had, then they can remain in the US beyond 1 year. And that means they would have authorization to work remotely in the US. Of course, one of the requirements would be that the individual's company, that the UK company had an establishment in the US, a legal establishment in order to sponsor this individual. If they didn't, it would have been pretty challenging to get a work visa for someone in the US. So we're going to touch upon those issues going forward, but that's one thing that companies have been facing in the pandemic, more so than maybe what we've seen before, just because of the nature of remote work. And what is remote? Was it, at your home and outside London, or did the employee pack up and head to the US? May, what about this individual's ability to return to the UK after this extended absence?
So it's interesting because his visa is still valid until September 2022. So you'd think actually it's fine because it's still valid. He should be able to come in, and that's probably true. But he just needs to watch out on a couple of things. One is that he will be questioned a lot at port to see why he was out and see if it's still sponsored by the UK employers. And the second thing is that there's going to be question on compliance in terms of, is he really needed in the UK? He's managed to do his job for so long in the US. Does he still need to come back and work in the UK and to be sponsored in the UK? But the quick answer is yes. If he's still sponsored, his visa is valid, yes, he can come back in the UK.
And as you said before, there shouldn't be any quarantine requirements for this individual, provided that he's fully vaccinated.
That's right. He just needs to do the day 2 test if he is fully vaccinated.
Dinesh, this individual has gone to the UK. He's a UK employee. Presumably, let's say for initially that the UK company did not have an entity in the US, or maybe it doesn't make a difference. Are there any issues from a UK tax perspective or a UK benefits perspective that the company would have or should have addressed once they realized that the individual is working from the United States, or from anywhere for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, we see loads of cases like this. So it wasn't the design, it just happened. And the big one is really payroll. So you've got somebody who's living and working in the US, probably taxable in the US, right? The hint is the wife who's there. The home seems to be there. So the person is paying taxes in the wrong country. So that's going to cause some issues when the US tax returns are due. The payroll is in the UK. The UK tax has been paid rather than the US tax. So you've got this unfurling of like payroll issues, which quickly becomes a compensation issue, because if the person's paid UK tax on UK payroll and there's a payment to make April 15, well, where's the money to do that? You know, so you've got this real tale of complexity arising there. Depending on the corporate setup, there may even be a US payroll obligation here. That's not something we can dismiss. We would need to look at more. The individual or their employer should really have a certificate of coverage under the UK-US totalization agreement for Social Security. Otherwise, you've got 401k, Medicare, potentially you as well. So what you find here really is a kind of a compensation and payroll issue that will need to be unwound, and it will take a while and cause some pain because there's not really an exemption for this situation.
Yeah, bottom line is if the company doesn't have an establishment in the US, it's very difficult to work through these issues and stay in compliance because you've got compliance on both sides. You know, we talked about an individual staying in the US for 1 year. They've established US taxable presence. That means that they're subject to filing and paying US taxes on their worldwide income. So even if they remain on payroll, in the UK, and the L1 visa for that matter would permit that, that doesn't necessarily change their US tax obligations.
Correct.
Yeah. And like you said, there's agreements between the US and the UK, but these are no simple matters. So all of this has to be taken into account. That's why, although individuals are mobile, they're not so mobile when it comes to compliance.
Yeah, exactly. And a UK resident, this is the other thing we see, they may have certain investments or bank accounts which are completely normal, acceptable in the UK, create no headaches. You become a US taxpayer and they create headaches. So don't be surprised if there's some other compliance there to be done. The only one that might be easy is a pension, actually. If it's a bog standard UK pension, the UK-US tax treaty should give similar treatment, but detail needs to be worked through.
Can I also just add on the case study one, in terms of the individual coming back to the UK? Obviously, it's fine for him to come back to the UK, but what the employer might want to, and the individual might want to look at is whether or not it'll impact, the absence will impact on his settlement application, if that is something that he's eligible for and he's looking to apply in the UK. Because usually a skilled worker visa, for example, does lead to settlement after 5 years, but it's limited to obviously 180 days outside the UK each year in any 12 months period. There are some concessions in place because of COVID and what reasons for absences due to COVID, but we need to look into and make a case for them if that's something that's going to impact on their application.
Okay, thank you all. I'm going to go to the next case study, and then we'll leave a few minutes for questions as well. I do see 2 questions in the chat. I think we just answered the second question just in this last discussion, but I'll read it and then we can reiterate. If you're a UK company and you have a US citizen living and working for you in the UK who wants to return to the US to spend extended period of time with their family in the US where you have no business entity, is it possible to accommodate this request without risking any US tax exposure? I'm going to say that I'm going to let Dinesh answer, but I'm going to say I think the short answer is without risking any US tax exposure is probably a big no.
Yeah. I mean, if the person's working in the US, there's more. Expect there to be US taxes.
Yeah,
that's kind of a sensible rule of thumb.
Yep. It would be something different if the individual took a full year leave of absence, but again, US taxable presence is based on presence. And so if an individual isn't even working in the United States, but they are deriving income outside the United States and they become a tax resident, we're one of the few countries that has the pleasure of taxing that individual on their worldwide income. So to the extent that is something that could be easily worked out, not so. Let's touch upon this last case study, and and I think this will also address maybe some of the questions that we have. So a UK company has offices in London, San Francisco, and Hong Kong. They have 4 employees who need to relocate, desire to relocate. A PRC Chinese national and a Hong Kong national will go to London. A Chinese national will go to their San Francisco office, and a UK employee wishes to go down to Costa Rica, where the company has no legal presence. Initially, they're not sure of the duration of these relocations. Could be up to 3 months initially, or it could stay longer. And there's some flexibility as to when and if they'll put them on local payroll. So this is a lot, and so we'll probably just have to briefly touch upon this, but it also touches upon points that we've just discussed. So for the UK, what are the 2 immigrant or visa options that they'll have for the Chinese versus the Hong Kong national?
There's the main, the main visa options for work in the UK is skilled worker intra-company transfer, but that does require the company to get a sponsor license first. If the company doesn't yet have a sponsor license, they need to look at other options. One for the Hong Kong national, there's a couple more options. There is currently the BNO visa, British national overseas. If they have that status, then they could come over and apply for a 3-year, 5-year visa to work in the UK. Also, if they're under 30, there is the Youth Mobility Scheme visa, which allows them to work for 2 years with a sponsorship into that category. But it is something that they can just come over and then work. And then if they need to stay longer, they can always switch in the UK when they have a license. Unfortunately, for the Chinese national, they will need to get a license for. So if they haven't got one, there'll be a slight delay with the visa process. But if they do have one, then we'll probably look at either the intercompany transfer visa or the skilled worker visa if they're looking for settlement.
So, and Dinesh, you can chime in on this too, because this also goes to one of the questions we have. If this company wants to kind of fly under the radar, so to speak, and not get a work visa or not have to be concerned about taxes, can it just manage its placements of these employees and others to maybe under 2 or 3 months going into the UK? And I can also speak to that point in the US as well.
I can try and start. I know what the immigration answer will be from May. I think duration plays a role in whether or not somebody is taxable. So if we're talking 3 months, potentially there might be an exemption if their person retains an overseas employer and they spend less than 183 days and there's no cross charge to the UK. So potentially there's something that can be done. However, what we have to do with UK is there's always an override to consider. It's called economic employer, right? So even if you are not employed in the UK and you're here for a short period of time, are you actually doing a job or a role that economically benefits a UK entity? So for example, if you were a front of house hotel and you spent 3 months doing front of house hotel in London, there's no argument. You're clearly benefiting the business, right? It's like, how can you pretend? So even if you were there for a short period of time, you could have income tax and taxes to think about. So really, time does play a role, as does the employment structuring, as does the cross-charging element. But really, really important, we have to get into what are the actual duties and what is their level of integration with the host organization. I'll let May cover the immigration piece question.
As a visitor, they're only limited to permissible activities, and it's very, very limited. Like I said, if it's anything to do with work, then they will be questioned at port when they enter, questioned at the office if they're found working. It'll result in fines for the employers if they were working and they didn't have the permission and they were here as a visitor. I mean, for the Chinese national, she would actually have to apply for a visitor visa as well. So that's going to be more difficult for her to come over to the UK on the basis that she can justify spending 3 months here without working as a business visitor.
Yeah, and I'll just add on the US side, it is a little bit about duration, but it's mostly about the activities. So for instance, the Chinese national coming into the US, they could get a business visitor, a B1 visa to come over to the US. That would permit them to stay up to 6 months, as opposed to people that are eligible for the visa waiver, which is up to 90 days. But people sometimes get confused thinking, well, that means we can just work them for up to 6 months, but the activities are limited. A business visitor is really coming over to benefit and work on behalf of their role and their employer abroad, as opposed to taking over duties or doing a job that someone normally in the US would perform. That's one big distinction. There's a famous example, famous case in US immigration that ties back to a Hong Kong tailor that was initially denied a visa, but it was determined that the purpose of their travel was to take measurements of clients here in the United States and then go back and construct the garment in Hong Kong. And that was deemed permissible under the business visitor visa. Tax is different though. The tax, you start to accrue the tax days, so to speak, the minute you arrive, regardless of what you're doing. Again, we have these rules that create taxable presence after 183 days, but that could be reduced when you do a calculation from year to year to year, depending on how much time one stays in the US. And it could get down to a threshold as low as 120 days. So the immigration and tax on the US side don't always sync up. Here's a final question, which also touches upon the points here. If we have an entity, if we don't have an entity but need a visa, can we use an unrelated third party to obtain a visa for an employee in the name of the third party and then have the employer work exclusively for us through that third party? That's a great question. And I can say that on the US side, that can work for certain visas. You can use, let's say, a professional employment organization that contracts with the US company. That organization then becomes the actual visa sponsor. There are limitations as to where that setup will work depending on the given visa. For instance, an H-1B visa has limitations regarding who controls the individual. The sponsor must exert the overall control of the individual, and there's limitations as to how much they can contract out for that visa. But that is a possibility on the US side. What about on the UK side?
It's actually it depends on the situation of the facts and what the contract arrangement is, but usually the Home Office do not allow sort of employment agency sort of type relationship. So if the sponsor is not the employer, we need to see what is the relationship, and if it's just simply so that they can sponsor someone to work at a different site, then that is not permitted. If they are, for example, a company that is here in the UK and they're providing services to that client, for example, then that could be permitted as long as the control and the responsibilities remain with the sponsoring company.
Yep.
Okay, and with that, we've come to the conclusion of our time, and we want to thank everyone for joining. And if you have any further questions, then please reach out. You can reach out through Joe, and the questions will find their way to us.
Absolutely. So with that, thank you very much to everyone that joined us today, and especially to all our panelists for this excellent presentation. It's been fun working with you to put this together. Reach out to me, Jay Healy at babcsf.org if you would like to connect with our panelists. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.